Okay, I think this is started right now. Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you for waiting for me, and thank you for attending these lectures. Tonight, I want to present Saint Justin of Celije, one of very prominent Serbian saints of recent time. As we know, many of our saints from recent time have some particular role, and they are recognized by some specific manifestations of their being saint based on their deeds, on their work, on their life, and many things taken together, but some of them taken particularly. So for Saint Father Justin, we can say that his main pivotal things of his life were his teaching and writing, and in both of these, he came to the fullness of the divine life or life in God, giving the example of how the presentation of the written deeds or like text and his books have such a crucial influence on the whole Serbian people all over the world, and particularly in our old lands of Serbia and Serbian lands there. As you might know already from the past, Saint Justin of Celije is one of the saints whose work is most felt in most of the 20th century when he was working and he was living there. Saint Justin was born in 1894 in a village near Valjevo. As we know from the previous lectures, another saint, Saint Bishop Nikolai Velimirovic, was born also in that area. And it's very close, the distance, spatial distance there. So we can say it's the area of saints in Serbia, nearby Valjevo. Bishop Nikolai was born in Lelic, which is on the other side of the city. And at the same time, Bishop Nikolai was spiritual and even a real technical teacher of Father Justin. We can call Father Justin Ava Justin. That's how he's recognized as well. He's also recognized as Justin or Justin, whatever it's proper to say in English. Saint Justin, the new, which means the new theologian or the new Serbian theologian. That adjective new is very rarely given to any theologian. As we know, there are only three among theologians of Holy Fathers who are recognized as the theologians with that adjective given to their name. That's Saint John, the theologian, the writer of one of four Gospels. The other one is Saint Gregory, the theologian, a great father and bishop from 4th century. And the last one is a saint from 10th or 11th century, Saint Simeon or Simon, the theologian. He's also called the new theologian because the development of theology falls mostly in first 7 centuries during the times of councils, the great councils of when the dogma and the Orthodox faith was established in written form. So all those who were writing and living after that time were recognized just later, and their work was entitled by the adjective new theologian. So the Father Justin was also one of those, and he's the only Serbian theologian who was recognized as such, as great, so that his name was added by that adjective. As you know, also in that area, there are many monasteries. So nowadays, there are monastery of Celije, where Father Justin spent most of his life. At the same time, It's a monastery Lelic, in the village of Lelic, where Bishop Nikolai was born, which was established later based on Bishop Nikolai's becoming saint. And Father Justin was born in a very pious family. His last name is same as mine, last name Popovic. Although I cannot say that I have any relatives connected with Saint Justin, because my family is from past, came from Montenegro to Bosnia and so on. But Father Justin's family of Popovic are from southern Serbia. And so far I know they have also different Krsna Slava. So it is very common last name, family name, as you know, one of the most common last names together with Petrovic. So Popovic associates with some relatives or some ancestors being priests. And that was exactly the case in the family of Saint Justin, whose 7 relatives or 7 ancestors, 7 fathers and grandfathers, were successively priests of the Serbian Orthodox Church at that time. And the last one before him was his grandfather. And then his father stopped that tradition for the reason of the will of his father, or Justin's great father, who didn't want his son to be a priest, but only to support and help church as being a chanter and, let's say, altar man or something like that. So Saint Ava Justin continued tradition after one generation being stopped. And his family was also famous by something else there. At that time, you might know, in past, there was a high mortality rate among the newborn babies. And in order to prevent that, there was a kind of tradition, not based in Orthodox faith, but just in kind of Serbian old tradition, to give some specific names for the kids in order to prevent the deaths of the kids. So brother and sister, the 2 siblings of Saint Justin, had those names of Stojan and Stojadinka, which means like those who will stay, who won't die. And the same was with the youngest one, Saint Justin, whose baptismal name was Blagoje, which is also meaning something like as nice or merciful. And it's also connected with that, giving thanks to God for the kids staying alive. So there were 3 of them in the family of his father and mother. And he was born in the city of Vranje, this is southern Serbia. And later on, being very talented in school and during the education, he pursued a school of theology. He decided to go to theological seminary, where his teachers were very prominent, outstanding people, outstanding persons of that time, the beginning of 20th century. He went exactly to Belgrade School of Theology, or Belgrade Theological Seminary, which was at that time already reformed. As you know, Bishop Nikolai was also attending that school, but a few years before Saint Justin. And at the time, school lasted shorter, and there were like mandatory to have 4 years of middle school, which we can say now middle school. It was like lower gymnasium. At the time, like 4 to 6 grades be completed in order to be accepted to the School of Theology, Theological Seminary. But later on, it was extended from 5 years of theological seminary to 9 years of education. So those who completed only elementary school were accepted, and that was the case with Saint Justin. So he was educated for 9 years. It's a longer time, as he stayed in Belgrade School of Theology. Among those teachers were, as I mentioned before, Saint Bishop Nikolai, but also very famous composer Stevan Mokranjac, whose compositions, whose music we sing in church up to nowadays, as you know. And among the other prominent Serbian scientists, there was so famous Veselin Čajkanović, a very prominent Serbian philologist and literary critical and very prominent in the area of literature. And the other one was also Miroslav Popovic, who later became a professor at the School of Theology at Belgrade University. And as you know, at the time, toward the end of the education of Saint Justin, there started wars. It was a heroic period of Serbian history, starting with the First and Second Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913, when Serbia expanded its territory to the south in efforts together with Bulgaria and Greece, whereby they expelled the Turkish Ottoman Empire and established the territories over the Balkan Peninsula. And later on, there was an ongoing of First World War. At the time, Saint Justin was about to graduate this theological school, and he was not enlisted to participate in the military forces, but he was prepared for priesthood at the time. But he decided not to stay in the occupied Serbia. Eventually, he took part in the withdrawal of the Serbian forces, first to Albania, then later to Greece, to the island of Corfu, where most of military was stationed there. And he stayed there for a year. At the same time, he was a witness of the great events of the time, like suffering of many of the people from Serbia, many soldiers who passed away during the withdrawal in Albanian mountains during the winter. It was the winter time of 1915, 1916. And at the time, he was assured that he wanted to become a monk. So on January 1st, 1916, the very beginning of that year, he became a monk. He was tonsure the monk, with obtaining a monastic name, Justin, based on a Justin philosopher, who is also a very prominent theologian from the 2nd century. And based on his great performance in school and his love for sciences, particularly for philosophy and theology, that was why his name was chosen in that way. And he was sent soon afterwards to continue his theological education at the Theological Academy in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he stayed only a little bit over a year. And then with the ongoing and starting of revolution, Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, it was not suitable to stay there anymore. So he was withdrawn from there, and it was suggested to him to go to Oxford, to UK, since many of professors from seminaries in Serbia went there and took all the seminarists, all the students, to stay there and to continue their education. Also, some other schools continued the education of the high school kids there in order not to disrupt the education. And the United Kingdom offered Serbian, let's say, the Serbian state to have this opportunity to stay in a special designed schools in UK for those Serbian kids, which were taught by teachers from Serbia. Among them, there were also Bishop Nikolai at the time, who stayed there for years, giving sermons and serving in those churches there. he has also a kind of missionary activities there, and therefore Saint Justin was sent there to stay closer to the other theologians and other prominent persons who had their role to support the defense of Serbia and its role in the war. At the same time, he chose to stay at Oxford, among great prominent school of theology. He stayed there for 2 years, in fact, preparing for the bachelor degree, which at that time was equivalent as a PhD nowadays. So there was also reform of UK education system. So it was licentiate of theology, as called at the time, or it's now also called the Sacred Theologia Licentiatus, that's in Latin, so it means some kind of master degree. But at the time it was recognized as PhD. So he started preparing his thesis on the philosophy and theology of the famous great Russian writer Dostoevsky. And once he was done with writing thesis and submitted it to the committee members, unfortunately, he was rejected because he openly criticized the influences of Western culture in the Orthodox Church, and he started with something that was a main, let's say, governing point of his theology later in the decades afterwards. So he started at the first written work of his with these statements that Western culture has some not good influences onto the Serbian theology and also on Orthodox theology in general, which was recognized by Fyodor Dostoevsky in his works. And in this way, he also interpreted Dostoevsky as critics of the Western culture. And it was not suitable for the committee members, and they asked Saint Justin to change it slightly to be acceptable. But he did not want, he didn't want to obey to this commandment, so he gave up education there. At the same time, it was 1919, the end of the First World War, and it was a new opportunity for him to take part in the education system in Serbia, where he went back. And at the same time, in 1920, he became hierodeacon. He was ordained by Patriarch Demetrius of Serbia. Maybe I mentioned it before, I'm not sure. Let me see, or it's afterwards. Okay, so yeah, it's afterwards. I can jump it and get it back here. Yeah, as you might know from the previous lectures about Bishop Nikolai, at the end of the war, there was a movement to unify the Serbian church territories from the different states, which after the war became unified into the state of Yugoslavia. And also Serbian church, at the time it was like in plural, wanted to unify and again to restore the Patriarchate of Serbia. And it was done in 1920, when all the bishops from the different territories which belonged to different states before the war assembled in Sremski Karlovci, which was in past the seat of the Karlovci Metropolitan. And there made a decision of unification. It was known as a Council of Unification in May 1920. So Serbian Patriarchate was restored as it was from 16th through 18th century of Patriarchate of Peć. At the time, Metropolitan of Serbia, Dimitrios Pavlovic, was elected Patriarch. And at that time, he also ordained Saint Justin, as I mentioned just previously, to the rank of hierodeacon. It's a rank, it's a monastic rank, which corresponds to the deacon rank in the married priesthood. And later on, in September of 1919, Saint Justin was sent to Athens to continue his education in a more orthodox area, since at the time already Russia was conquered by Bolsheviks, by communists, so it was not suitable to be sent there back. At the time, it was even Christians were persecuted, as you know. So Saint Justin was sent to Athens, the only remaining theological school with a degree of PhD, where he was sent to obtain. And eventually he obtained his thesis in 1926. But before that, in 1921, he was called back to Serbia to assume the position of professor at the Karlovci Theological Seminary. And he was professor there for several years. At that time, he started writing in many prominent magazines and journals. With several other prominent theologians of that time, he established a very prominent journal, theological journal, which is called Hrišćanska misao, or Christian Thought. And it was a journal especially targeted by younger theologians, students of theology, and so on. And even there, Saint Justin started with a critical points of view on many problems in Serbian church at that time, on not well educated and the priesthood and priests who are not filling their duties properly, and among also the influence of the secularism of that time and the changing of the atmosphere and the manner of the life and traditional life of Serbian people once they joined the other territories and unified into Yugoslavia. So we can say at that time he found some seeds which would later, 2 decades later, bring the communism and atheism and materialism into the Serbian society. Even at that time, he started a critical opinion on some origins of that phenomenon. The same was with the Bishop Nikolai, who started it even on a greater manner, with higher tone. And for that reason, partly for that reason, he was sent away from Belgrade to very small southern diocese of Ohrid and Bitolj, where he stayed for 15 years, kind of punishment, which we can recognize. But at the same time, Justin was also sent from one seminary to the other to be teacher in different of them, also as a kind of punishment. They tried to, some authorities, some church authorities, influenced or pressured by statesmen, tried to remove Justin from writing of such in such a manner, but nothing could stop him, as you might guess this. So it was a time when he was changing from one theological seminary to the other, and at the same time he started generating the circle of the new theologians, new generation, who would assume the new challenges and contemporary problems at that time, to be prepared to react and face them proper way. Among those, there were several bishops, which would later, after the Second World War, became bishops, like Vasilije Kostić, Hrisostom Vojnović, and the one who was a bishop in Western America diocese until 1985. It was Bishop Grigorije Uditsky. So Bishop Vasilije Kostić was very prominent disciple of Father Justin, and he also graduated at the Athens Theological School later, like in 30s, 37, 38, becoming a doctor of theology, and became a bishop in Bosnia first, like in 1947, after the war. And he was also prosecuted a lot and was sent from one to the other diocese. So all those disciples received some of the talents some of divine talents given to their teacher, Ava Justin. For instance, Vasily received this being so powerful and like with a, let's say, hot temper, and very zealous in preaching and also in giving the faith and in keeping it preserved. While the other side, Bishop Chrysostom was very peaceful and quiet personality, but the other side, he was a great preacher, gave so many beautiful sermons, and which are also preserved in several books. So it was kind of attitude and manner which started as kind of giving some fruits and some good outcome, which Father Justin started at that time when he was teacher of these theological schools. And during the time when he was a professor at the theological seminary in Bitol, he had a great opportunity to stay with his teacher, Saint Bishop Nikolai, at the same time also with another saint of the Orthodox Church. It's Saint John Maximovich, Saint John of Shanghai and San Francisco, whose relics are here near us in a Holy Virgin Cathedral on the Geary Street, as you know. So it was such a wonderful place, great place for young theologians, for seminarists to receive not only the word of God through the lectures, but through the examples of living saints. Like 3 living saints were among them, which is really amazing. Particularly at that time, it was a period which gave also some impetus to Saint Justin for writing a greater synthesis, which he started after that time during the 30s, which eventually led him to becoming a professor at the University of Belgrade. So eventually in 1935, he assumed the position of professor of dogmatics. It's one of most important subjects in the course of the theological studies, both in undergraduate and graduate level. So in order to prepare himself for this duty, he started writing books for his lectures, books of dogmatics. So he wrote it eventually in 3 books. It's like part 1, part 2, and part 3. The first 2 parts were written before the Second World War, while the third one was written shortly before he passed away. As you know, at the time, University of Belgrade was comprised almost all in the old building. It was a building of Kapetan Misha in the center of Belgrade, which now is the rectorate of the university, like the head of the universities are there. And at that time, most of the schools and colleges were situated there. Only School of Engineering or College of Engineering, which we can say in the terms of Anglo-American education system, was at the time already displaced to the, where the School of Electrical Engineering in Belgrade is right now. So it was initially the School of Engineering in total. Does this work? No. Again, some technical problems. Oh, sorry. Okay. And during the 30s, most of the works from the first phase of writing of Saint Justin were done. Among that, it was the expanded thesis from Oxford, which was rejected at the time. Then later on, Father Justin started expanding it and transforming into the treatise. Eventually, it became a book. It was a philosophy and religion of Fyodor Dostoevsky, which later was published, as you can see here, as a book entitled Dostoevsky on Europe and Slavism, which is like an expanded version of the first one. Then also Dogmatics, which I mentioned as books for his lectures. And then he started also the other works, which eventually became very important. It's Foundations of Theology, it's Theological Abysses, The Progress in the Death Mill, and so on. Many of them. Mostly he comprehended here during this period most of the problems of contemporary theology between the two world wars, and with the ongoing crisis of the society, of the Serbian society. So he criticized materialism, he criticized the ecumenical achievements, he also criticized many other things. So during his, let's say, younger age, he was really kind of rebel in theology. We can wonder how such a personality could become a saint. But as you can see here, it's not just like being more like zealous or less, or like more quiet or not. It does not mean that we can determine one who would be saint or not to become a saint. But something else, like all our energies, all our talents can be fertilized and give good fruits and good outcomes, which should be brought to God. And as we received it from God, we should bring it back, but multiplied or generated in a like reformed version of, let's say. So that's the same point which was done by Saint Justin of Celije in his lifetime. So his talent of the living word, a very authentic word, very authentic thoughts, sometimes very sharp, but really deep. They were kind of the talent which he possessed and which he transformed into something really big before God. And then there started a Second World War in Yugoslavia in 1941. As you know, after 2 years of war in Europe, and it was years of troubles for many Serbian people, years of prosecution, many deaths, as you know. So during the time of anarchy, both in the state, which was dissoluted and separated in several parts, as you know, and at the same time, it was kind of loss of the organization in the Serbian Orthodox Church at the time, because many bishops were either condemned to death and murdered, or they were prosecuted. So at that time, Saint Justin started visiting many parishes, trying to revive the life among people in all those areas where there was no military activities. So he moved from one monastery to another, from one church to another, to help this. A bit longer he stayed in monastery Blagoveštenje. It's in Ovčar and Kablar Valley. As you know, he stayed there for a while because it was relatively safer than some other monasteries in Serbia at the time. And there he encountered many Chetnik movements and Chetnik groups, among them of Major Palošević, who was deputy secretary of the movement of General Draža Mihajlović, some other among them. This would later become a reason for the persecution of Saint Justin by communists on the accusation that he supported the Chetnik movements. But what is the real truth in this case is that he acted as a man of God who was preaching the word of God and serving divine services anywhere that he was asked to do that, and in all the parishes which had a need for that, but not in the case that he um, showed any kind of political activity or engagement in any political party or any Chetnik movements itself. The other thing, which was also kind of accusation by communists, was that, which was also true, it was that in early 1944, General Draža asked him to support a congress which he made in the village of Ba in western Serbia, in order to try to make the ideology of the Chetnik movement in order to counteract the communist movement, which a few months before that had a very famous congress of the so-called Avnoj and so on, the Communist Congress, which tried to make the ideology of how the next state should be organized in the manner of socialist republics and so on. So General Draža tried to counteract this and face these challenges, and wanted also someone from Serbian Orthodox Church to give a manifesto of what should be the goals of so-called movement Svetosavlje. As you might, it's a bit difficult to translate this term. It's kind of, let's say, Serbian Orthodox Christian ideology of like being based and founded onto the deeds and, let's say, archetypes, examples given and founded by Saint Sava. So our Serbian Orthodox Church is Saint Sava's church, as it is the first among the saints in Serbian saints, you know. So that's all the ideology of Serbian Orthodox Church. Or not say ideology is not proper word, it's better to say just the manner of the life of Serbian Orthodox Christians is a manner of life resembling Saint Sava's life in a way, and Saint Sava's principles of Christian faith, which he gave to Serbs. And in that manner, Father Justin tried to develop that model in nowadays, in contemporary time. So to give the aspects, every aspect of life, he also gave some propositions on how the relation between state and church should be, how to organize that, whereby he saw state as kind, let's say, subordinated to church, and as the state is also interceded and, let's say, always trying to see the full example and full model in church, not the opposite. It was also a bit unacceptable among many of the intellectuals of that time, but he was really a Christian intellectual person, and that was the instance of those Christian thinkers of the time. So it was also kind of accusation for Saint Justin, as they called him an ideologist of Chetnik movement, which is also kind of simplification of his real role at the time. And at the end of the Second World War, there started a period by which Saint Justin was remembered, and in which he gave his fullness of his testimony of the faith he lived and he was writing. And it was that in 1945, first of all, he was expelled from the university. But immediately after that, he was also put on the list for the execution without trial. He was there with many other intellectuals who eventually were executed, among them several prominent authors, several prominent scientists, professors, most of the intellectual elite of Serbia at that time. But who saved his life among the people? I mean, also definitely it was God's will that Saint Justin was Saint Justin's life was preserved at that time, but the one who acted among people to save this, it was a very famous author before the Second War. It was Stevan Jakovljevic, who is a brother of the other prominent Serbian writer, Milica Jakovljevic or Mirjam. And that Stevan was a professor of biology and also part of university. And for some reason, he decided after the war, although before the war he was also part of the Christian movement of the thinkers and so on. Later on, he changed his position and became a part of the communist regime. But he acted to protect Saint Justin. And his name was erased from that list. That's only what is known. After that, he withdrew to monastery Celije. He was asked by Abbess Sara at that time in 1948 to go there. Before that, he also was imprisoned for several months, then released, and again imprisoned, and it was repeating several times. But he was always very firm and very steadfast in his faith and in all his relation to the newly communist government. It was also a bit strange and unusual to show such a stubbornness and stiffness. And eventually it was also good for Saint Justin that he did not accept any kind of compromise, as he witnessed all along his life. That was the same after the war. So eventually he came to monastery Celije in 1948. And shortly afterwards, there was a decree issued by the communist government so that he must stay there as a kind of home imprisonment. And it was extended several times during the next decades so that he eventually was never released from that kind of status until his death in 1979. So for more than 30 years, he stayed in monastery Celije with no permission for moving away from there. He could only walk away around the property of the monastery lands around, but no further. It was kind of imprisonment of in Christian tradition, as you might know. There was also a very famous bishop, Theophan, the prisoner, called the prisoner. In fact, he was deliberately imprisoned by his own will, staying in monastery for 15 years. So that's kind of tradition for some saints to stay, not moving, or just concentrating themselves in the ceaseless prayer and ceaseless devotion to God, only writing and reading and prayer. And that was similar to Saint Justin. At the time, he was about in mid-50s. He technically was not the abbot of monastery because it was a nuns monastery. There was a Abbess Sara and sisterhood there. But Saint Justin acted as a spiritual father, or as we say, duhovnik, there for all this time. And it was a great opportunity for many intellectuals, many prominent Christian people from Serbia, from Yugoslavia, but also abroad, to come and visit him. As the time was proceeding, passing by, more and more people get to know about Saint Justin and wanted to meet and see him, and also to get some advice from him. That was also a nice opportunity to me to meet several of these people who gave me testimony that they went at some point in time to visit Saint Justin, asking him for some crucial advice for their lives. One of them is Abbot Elia, or Eli. He's a Frenchman who was in fact a Roman Catholic monk, and later he decided to become an Orthodox monk after he visited Father Justin, and then afterwards he went to Mount Athos, where he became Orthodox monk and Orthodox priest, then eventually getting back to France, where he established Orthodox monastery in the central France. And many other people also from Greece. At that time, he also started to be some kind of spiritual guidance for many younger theologians. As you can see here, this is an interesting photo in the center. This is Father Justin, which is very recognizable personality. You can recognize him with the cross on his hat, but next to him is a very famous saint of Romania, Romanian people, Saint Elder Cleopa. So we again see many saints, saint people, saint clergymen were coming to visit Saint Justin. This is a photo just a year or 2 years prior to his death, like in 1977, I think, when Elder Cleopa was about 65. And there, the photo to the right, you see in the center, it's Abbess Sarah with two nuns, which were also prominent witnesses about the life of Saint Justin, which also took part in a film, in a movie, which was recorded and made by some Christian authors recently, maybe 10 years ago, where these two nuns gave very nice testimonies. I strongly recommend that movie. I think it's also translated into English. So far I remember, yeah, that there is, or at least greater parts of that movie are translated, given on the YouTube. You can find it there. And other many prominent people. Here you see Bernard Le Caro is also from the French-speaking areas. He's from Switzerland. This is a theological and a Christian writer. And this is Mother Glyceria, which I mentioned, who is now abbess of Celije monastery, and who stayed there, who came as a young girl in early 50s. So she stayed there for 25 years together with Saint Justin. And several young theologians were sent by Saint Justin to Athens, where he also graduated his PhD. So he recommended them at the time to go again to Athens or to Thessaloniki, but definitely to Greece, because at the time still there was the Soviet Union. It was impossible to go to Russia. And Romania was also another option, but Romania was also under the communist regime, Bulgaria as well. So at the time, the Holy Synod of Serbian Church was about to send most of talented theologians to the School of Theology in Greece to complete their PhDs. So that was the case with these prominent theologians of our time, which all four of them are still alive. You can see them in the central photo here. It's Bishop Atanasie Jeftic to the far left, then Bishop or ex-Bishop Artemie, which you might know him from some controversies 10 years ago when he was defrocked. Then to the right, it's first Bishop Irinei of Bajka and Metropolitan of Montenegro, Amfilohije, who were disciples of Saint Justin and were coming to him for many years, getting advice from him and leading their lives and their prominent roles in Serbian theology and Serbian church in the decades, the last years of Ava's life, and later on during the 80s, 90s, and up to now. So, as I already mentioned, Father Justin of Celije reposed peacefully in Lord on the same day when he was born, 85 years ago. Before that, it was on April 7th or March 25th in the old calendar, which in 1979, which is the feast day of Annunciation, by which he received his baptismal name of Blagoje, which means Blagovesti, and Blagoje, it's very similar, as you know. And for many years, it was his tomb place was a place for pilgrimage in Serbia. Many faithful people were coming there organized or separately, whatever, to visit and see his relics and anyway. And here also I put the photo of his bust in city of Vranje, where he was born, and one of the schools is dedicated to him, to his name, as in honor to him. So this is just one part of everything that we can say of Saint Justin. Many other things here can be discussed now and talked about. Is one of that is his stance, his position toward many of these movements during the turbulent 20th century. Among them, his position towards the ecumenism. He was criticizing the ecumenical movements and efforts toward the unification of the confessions and different confessions like Protestants and Orthodox or Anglicans or the Roman Catholics and so on. So he was very in very critical position toward that, because he was seeing that it might be just making compromises from Orthodoxy, but not with getting anything that those non-Orthodox can recognize and accept the Orthodoxy. So in some by some theologians in modern time, it was that position of Father Justin was interpreted in different manners, but anyway, he was always in a bit strong position in most of his teachings. And all his literary works were eventually published, and it's a really big opus, big work. It's about 25 published books with over 10,000 pages in total, which is really productive. So that's what is the most important part of his life. And there were also several testimonies of the miracle events during his life and after his death. One of them was that at some point, it was about the early 50s, 1952 or 53, that during the communist persecution of the monasteries and churches and expropriation of the territories and lands and so on, monastery fell into the poverty. And they didn't have even some wheat to make bread and so on, not even some other food. And at some moment, Abbess Sarah asked what to do, and she was really concerned, deeply concerned. Although she and all the nuns were doing constant prayers, but they were a bit or just touched by this, what is going on. At that time, it was said that Father Justin gave them support, saying, just pray to God, put your all faith to God, and he won't forget us. And it was the case that as the abbess and nuns witnessed, the next morning they found their food storage room full of wheat, with no explanation how it became, what happened and what was the case there. And there were several other testimonies about the miracles, about healing some paralyzed or heavily, gravely sick persons who came to Father Justin for reading prayers and staying there for receiving some help from him. And it was said that after many prayers, like for a long time, maybe not just at once, but after many days or even many months, there was a healing. One of them was happened in 1959. It was a case. It was a younger lady, mother of a kid, who came there paralyzed, brought in a blanket. But afterwards, after reading prayers for her for several days, she was able to start walking, and eventually she went back home on their bare feet. Sorry. And another one was about one of the nuns there was possessed by demonic forces, by demons. And Father Justin was praying for several days as well, or maybe even several months. I can't remember now how the story goes on. Eventually, that young girl, gradually started repenting. But that's also the point which we must recognize here. It's not only that prayer acts automatically, but it needs the changing of the life and the repentance of the person who suffers. It was the case with that girl. She started repenting, and the more she was repenting, the better her state was, her mental and spiritual state. Eventually, she was released by the demonic forces, and she decided to spend life in monastery. She became a nun named Tatiana. She passed away about 20 years ago. And her tomb is also there in the graveyard in the monastery. So I would finish now. It's about 55 minutes of my talk. Please let me know if you have any questions and any comments. And thank you for your attention.
Hi, Miroslav.
Hey, Ron.
I had a question. I know you discussed this before on another lecture, but why did the patriarch cease to exist in the 18th century?
Oh, patriarchate was, how to say, terminated by the decree of the Sultan, Turkish Sultan, in 1766. What happened is that before that, it was very complicated. It was very complicated historically. At that time, Turks wanted patriarchs of Orthodox people, both for Greeks, for Serbs, for every of them, to be somehow pressured by them and kept them in kind of depending on the Ottoman government. And they were asking all the newly elected bishop to pay a big tribute, big taxes, everything, so that all the bishops needed to go through their faithful people, through the diocese, asking for money, not even asking, but trying to collect money in any way. So in order to do that, it was very difficult for Serbian people, Serbian bishops, to go through their faithful people and ask and doing some kind of collecting money. It was really unpopular. So eventually, in later decades, last decades of Serbian Patriarchate, not Serbian people were elected bishops in the Serbian church, but Greeks, Phanariot Greeks from city of Constantinople or Istanbul, and were sent among Serbian people to collect that and to stay there as bishops. So they were very unpopular. And there were many rising issues and controversies about that. And what also was the case, that people were complaining to the government on their bishops, or bishops were complaining to people. There were many bad things occurring there. So after the death of one of those patriarchs, who also was not, in fact, a Serb, ethnically Serb, but was ethnically Greek, the next one who was elected was again Greek, and that one asked the government to terminate the patriarchate and to unify it back to the mother church of Constantinople, which granted to autocephaly or independence of Serbian church to Saint Sava in 1219. So they just decided to get it back to that status before 1219. And then for 150 years, there was no patriarchate. In fact, for first 50 years, from 1766 until the Serbian uprisals at the beginning of 19th centuries, there was no patriarchate in Serbia and no bishops of the Serbian origin, but only Greeks. And it was really the part of Greek, or in fact, ecumenical patriarchate. But later, in the time of Miloš Obrenović, there was a metropolitan in Belgrade who started to be again Serb, not Greek. And from there on, metropolitans were Serbs, and metropolitan also get their it got its autonomy. So it was autonomous Serbian Orthodox metropolis in the area of Serbian kingdom at the time. And later on in 1920, after the unification of all the parts of previous Serbian Patriarchate in the one and unique territory, there was the re-establishment of Serbian Patriarchate. It was kind of historical details, a lot of historical details which brought to that situation. But thank you for your question.
You're welcome. Thank you for the lecture.
Any other questions or any comments, whatever? So these lectures or all this cycle is designed for everybody, just to be helpful to everybody, and for the discussion, not only for my presentation. I would like to see your feedback, any kind of thoughts, opinions, whatever. Or if there is no more question, so we can end this lecture. So thank you one more time for your attention. I hope this was helpful to you. I plan to have 2 more lectures about Serbian saints. The next one would be about Saint Mardaria and Sebastian, the saints of the America, Serbian saints in the United States. And then after that, I would give a lecture about 2 saints who were persecuted by communists, who were even murdered by communists. Unlike to Saint Justin, who was persecuted but not murdered. And that was the end of this cycle. Then we'll start something else and we'll see how to arrange that. Anyway, thank you one more time and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you.
You.
Thank you.